Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Wherever and whenever you are listening to this, welcome to the very first broadcast episode of the Race O'Clock podcast. My name is Daniel Gilligan. I am going to be your host for now and hopefully for a long, long time when it comes to this podcast. But first of all, we need to set some ground rules. I could talk about Formula One all day, every day of the week, and some of my friends, for, good or for ill, know that very, very well. And so as a result, with this podcast, you could be on your way to work. You could be listening in the background while you do some chores around the house. You could be doing whatever. I don't want to completely bore the pants off of you. And so as a result, every single episode, once we get all of the introductions out of the way, we're going to set a timer. And that's exactly what I'm doing now. So the maximum that I'm going to be talking is 1 hour. And that's it. Timer is a go. We've got an hour to discuss everything Formula One, or we usually would do. But this is the first episode, and unless you know me personally, you might be sat there listening and thinking, who is this guy? Why would I want to listen to him and his dulcet tones? Well, that's maybe one of the reasons. It's not a bad voice, I've been told. It's easy on the ear. But in terms of me, cliff notes. Let's get the introductions done out the way here. I am 28 years old, and of my 28 years on this planet, I've been watching Formula One for about 24 of them. It is a lifelong passion for me, with various different favourites over the years, but with that passion has come a deal of technical understanding, of historical knowledge, of all these other bits and pieces as well. But, of course, lots of people can lay claim to that, being lifelong fans of Formula One. What makes me any different to any of them? Well, I have, in addition to my 24 years of watching Formula One, got now coming into 6 years of experience working within Formula One. For me, this story, in terms of work at least, goes back to 2017. I graduated from university, and perhaps from this voice you will not be surprised to learn, I trained as an actor. It's what I still do now. It's very good fun when you do get to work. But I graduated in 2017, and I kind of didn't really know what I was doing at first. Some would argue I still don't now. But in terms of that, I was living with my dad at the time. And my dad was, at the time, in the Royal Air Force. I'm a military kid. It's why I sound like this, even though my dad is from Scotland and sounds an awful lot like this. He's probably not going to appreciate me doing an impression of him on the podcast, but there we go. And then my mum is from Yorkshire. And I don't think that I could really do her justice. My voice doesn't go that high anymore, ever since about sort of 12 years old. But in terms of that, then, that's where the neutral accent comes from. But living on military bases dotted around the country meant that at this particular point in time in 2017, I had a base just outside of London. It was in Buckinghamshire, was where this particular base was that we were living on at the time. And when it came to that, free bed and board right outside the city with all the major acting work in the UK, as it was at the time. And I thought to myself, great, this will be easy. Oh dear, it was not easy as it turned out. But what I ended up doing that typical actor thing. I waited on tables, I did delivery driving, I did other bits and pieces like that as the first kind of jobs out of university, waiting for the big breaks to come and all that sort of a thing. And, I've done little bits here and there. If you're particularly geeky, and I say that with all of the affection in the world, being a geek myself, then you might even recognise me from an online-only episode of Doctor Who that was broadcast in 2019. But when it came to 2017, that was the graduation. That was then moving forwards. We are now trying to be an actor. And it went that way until 2018, when my dad sort of turns to me and says, in the nicest possible way, you need to get out. Now, that wasn't him just deciding to boot me out. He extended the offer to continue to live with him, but the problem was he was then moving back to Scotland, because his time in the Air Force was coming towards its end. He was still going to serve for another few years at that point, but, we were no longer entitled to a house on that base, essentially. And with the nicest respect in the world, and I'm sure that he would say the same about me, we didn't fancy sharing a room in the officers' mess, the officers' barracks, to those not in the know for the Air Force lingo. And so, as a result, I then had to start thinking about a real job, Even if it was just temporarily, even if it was just for 6 months, just so I could get out of the house, get a constant stream of income, and then get myself moving on. Now, where on earth does Formula One come into all of that? Well, my team, ever since 2000, when my dad plopped me down in front of a television and pointed to a driver who had a saltire helmet driving around in a car called a McLaren, and, apologies. Yes, I know now that McLaren was started by Bruce McLaren, the New Zealander, but being 4 years old at the time, I didn't know any better. I saw Muck, I thought Scottish team, Scottish driver, my dad's Scottish, let's go ahead and support this team and driver. Now, McLaren, of course, for those of you who know, are based just outside of Woking in the UK, and so that is, again, for those not familiar with UK geography, just outside London, basically. It's about a 20-minute train to get to central London. And so I thought to myself, well, I've got a degree in acting. I've got just as much chance getting a great job as a rubbish job. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and apply for some Formula One teams, McLaren amongst them. McLaren had always been my team. They were the one I had the most knowledge on, the most passion for, and so I applied for a job. It was about as entry level as a Formula One job can be, I suppose. Not something that you needed a degree in aerodynamics in, or in mechanical design, no experience as being a mechanic or anything to that effect, but it was working as a night shift kitter and goods inwards person, or a stores person. And so I applied for it. My dad thought, keep dreaming, apply for some proper jobs now, please. And then I got a call. I was invited to an interview at the McLaren Technology Centre. And so I got myself into my best suit. There weren't many options to choose from, don't get me wrong. And I drove down there. I think I got there about 3 hours early. I was that paranoid about potentially being late to the interview. So I went and parked up somewhere else nearby and then went back at a more appropriate time. And I go into MTC, I look around, I'm absolutely awestruck by the place. And I go in for my interview and I sort of explain where I am in life and where my knowledge of Formula One comes from, my passion, and all these sorts of things. And they say, thank you very much. If you are considered, then we will get in touch. And I'll be honest, at that point, I thought that was the end of it. I'd applied to other teams. I'd applied for Williams, to Red Bull, to others. Again, for jobs which, on the face of it, would be entry level. Things like being a driver to take stuff to and from a subcontractor, or to and from the factory to a track. Something like that. Not to be causing any disrespect to anybody who might be a driver, but ultimately, the job descriptions of these things were you had to have a driver's license. And that was about it. So I then had applied to other places. I'd gotten flat rejections. So I just thought, well, McLaren are clearly curious and just humouring me. Maybe they fancied a laugh that day. And I thought that right up until the point when I got invited for a second interview. And I thought, oh, right, maybe this is actually something that could happen. And so I go along for the second interview, and there is a practical task associated with that interview. And I do the task, and then I get a bit of a chat with a couple of the guys who I potentially could be working with. And then a bit more time goes by, and eventually I then get the call saying, we would like to offer you the job. And so I went and I did the job for 6 months. It was some of the best 6 months of my life. Even though I wasn't acting, which is my main passion in life, certainly from a working perspective, I was doing probably the next best thing. And I think if I wasn't an actor, in all the other various multiple universes that run parallel to this one, where I don't have that particular drive and passion, then I probably would have just served my entire life working for McLaren. But it wasn't to be. And it was an experiment, ultimately, I think. McLaren could have gone with someone with a great deal of experience, but it would have had essentially to unlearn all of that experience into how to do it for other companies and learn to do it the McLaren way, or they could teach me how to do it the McLaren way from the off. And it didn't quite work out. I was going through a lot at the time, I think, mentally. Looking back on it, I don't think I acknowledged it at the time. And there were other bits and pieces. It just didn't quite gel together, but it was all very amicable, the way that it broke apart. There are some people I still know from that time and still speak to and have very fond conversations with. Natasha, if you're listening, for example. Love you to bits. But when it comes to then moving on from that, of course, that's just 6 months. I said I have 6 years worth of working in Formula One. And that then has come in the form of freelancing, working in events, doing commentary, doing corporate tours, doing all sorts of things like that in the world of Formula One. And it's one of these things where the nature of it means I can't say all of the things that I've done. I can't even say too small an amount of things I've done, really. But one thing I can definitely say is that I have done an awful lot of commentary for Williams Esports. If you check out their channel, there's a relatively good chance I could be one of the hosts commentating on something there. And then I have done some commentary at Abu Dhabi in 2023 for another team. Can't say who. And then, of course, going into this year, I will hopefully be being booked to do some more events out at the races as well. So all of this exposure to Formula One, the history of Formula One, storytelling in Formula One in particular, hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight as to how I tick, where I'm from, what I'm about, and that maybe you'll have just a little bit of faith that I'll know what I'm talking about. Some of the time, at least. But that's about me. And I have used up 10 minutes of my allocated hour. Now, of course, this is episode 1, or at least the first broadcast episode. I mentioned that at the top of the show because I did attempt a Race O'Clock podcast once before, but frankly, I think it was too similar to everything else that was being done at the time. And these first 1, 2, maybe 3 episodes, this isn't really how the show is going to be for the rest of the time that I do it, hopefully for many, many years to come. I think that what I want to start doing is I want us to have a community built up. I want to get some Q&As going on. I want to get some tweets, some emails to respond to. We might even do some call-ins like you would see on a radio show, for example. But for the time being, let's assume that everybody here is starting from zero. You could be someone who is a big Formula One fan like myself. You could be someone who works in Formula One like myself. Or you could be someone who is completely new. Maybe you've watched Drive to Survive. Maybe you're looking forward to Drive to Survive Season 6 coming out later on this month. Let's just make sure that we have a few terms nailed down and a few basic fundamentals when it comes to Formula One. Formula One itself is the best cars in the world. That is simply it. The best cars in the world, the best drivers in the world going around tracks at incredibly high speeds. It's how it's always been. Formula One started officially as a championship in 1950 at the British Grand Prix. And this is then where things evolve over time. It's now over 70 years, nearly 75 years of Formula One. And in that time, the cars have maintained their place as the best cars in the world. But they've changed a huge amount. In particular, you go back to 1950, and the cars of that era, they were big, heavy, they had enormous engines mounted in the front, and the drivers wore leather caps, maybe some goggles, and a polo shirt. Very different to today, where they have multiple layers of fireproof underwear, a fireproof race suit, a hands device that connects their helmet to their shoulders, essentially, to stop them from having a massive forward movement in the car if they have a crash. The helmets themselves, of course, are completely enclosed, full-face helmets made of carbon fibre. And, of course, the cars themselves are incredibly fast. They are the pinnacle of technology in Formula One. To just be able to illustrate one point briefly, modern Formula One cars have in them an internal combustion engine which is, without a doubt, the most sophisticated and most advanced thermal power unit that has ever been made by humanity. Not for race cars, not for road cars, but ever. In all of human existence, that is the best internal combustion engine that has ever been designed. And it sits in the back of a modern Formula One car. Isn't that great? Isn't that cool? It is just so many things that we kind of take for granted, certainly in terms of road cars and other areas of life, have come from the world of Formula One. Things like, for example, you're driving along in your road car and you happen to go over a bit of slippery patch of road. Well, if traction control kicks in your car and you are then saved from a potential incident, well, you can thank Formula One. Traction control was something that was pioneered in the early 1990s as a part of a number of different electronic driver aids designed to make the cars a bit easier to drive so the drivers could exploit more out of them. Things like ABS were another thing that came in this time as well, so you don't have to pump the brakes when you are going into a crash anymore. The car does that automatically for you to give you the most efficient emergency stop possible. So Formula One is the fastest cars, the fastest drivers, and the pinnacle of technology. It's also a huge amount of money. Business in Formula One is enormous. If you want to get involved in Formula One, you have got to have pockets deeper than certain parts of the Mariana Trench. It is incredible the amount of money that is involved in this sport. To give you some idea, the teams these days are limited in terms of how much they can spend. There was a cost cap introduced to Formula One in 2021. And when this was introduced, it was set at about $150 million per year. That's how much the teams would be spending. But they'd actually be spending more than that, because there were certain things not included in this cost cap and are still not included today. Things like the salaries of your drivers, the top 3 paid executives of the team, any marketing activities are outside of the cost cap, and a whole litany of other things. So that's just today when there is a cost cap involved. Prior to that, you look at the big 3 teams of Formula One's last decade. You have Mercedes-Benz, Ferrari, and Red Bull Racing. Those 3 big teams were spending in excess of $350 or even $400 million per year on their racing cars. These days, Formula One teams will make 3 or 4 chassis to use for the entire season. So 3 or 4 cars will just be taken around the world. They'll have various bits bolted onto them depending on what circuit they're going to, and then they go racing. They'll do that somewhere between 20 and, as it is this year, 24 times a year, and then that's it. That car is done. It doesn't get used again, typically. There are some asterisks to that throughout F1's history, particularly the further back you go. But as a general rule of thumb, in the modern day, you make a car for 1 year and 1 year only. And you'd be spending that much per year. So much so that Formula One teams were a loss-making organisation until this cost cap was introduced, and so money had to be garnered up through sponsorship, it had to be made via investment, it had to be all these other bits and pieces. And really, it was big motoring manufacturers that were coming in the 2000s in particular, that were really starting to drive these costs up, because of course they were having their own teams, their own representation. They wanted to be viewed as the best thing. And coming back to that issue of money, and of prestige in Formula One. To give you an example, really, of why Formula One is so important from a financial perspective for these teams, even back when they were spending so much as to make any other organisation go bankrupt, take Mercedes-Benz. They bought the Brawn GP team of 2009. If you've not seen the documentary about that particular team on Disney+, I would highly recommend it. But when it came to that particular team, 2009, Brawn wins the championship. Both the Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship. And what ends up happening after that is Mercedes buys the team. Brawn had gone through that entire season of 2009 with chronic underinvestment. They had to sack a number of people in the team, or rather, not sack them, but let them go. Be the more democratic way of putting it, I suppose. And they then had to essentially get through the year on a shoestring. They were not spending $400 million. They were probably spending less than $100 million, to be completely honest with you. I don't know what the figures were in terms of Brawn's accounts for that year. But Mercedes then buys a team which, yes, they won the championship the previous year, but because of that underinvestment, they were not ready to go and win a championship again in 2010. Fast forward to 2014, and this is then the point about money. Mercedes-Benz finally wins a championship in Formula One. Lewis Hamilton wins his second Drivers' Championship, and they win their first Constructors' Championship. And as a result of that, car sales of Mercedes versus Audi versus BMW in the UK suddenly take Mercedes from the third best-selling of those 3 brands to then the highest selling. Now, there is the phrase that correlation does not equal causation, necessarily. And certainly I would hope that's the case, because in my time working at McLaren in 2018, we did happen to produce one of the worst cars in McLaren's history. And then the moment I left going into 2019, the car suddenly got better again. So, I'm hoping that correlation doesn't equal causation there. But certainly when you then look at that championship win for Mercedes in 2014, you win in Formula One, suddenly your road car sales shoot up. I think you could make a reasonable argument that the two are linked. So it's pinnacle of motorsport, the fastest cars in the world, fastest drivers. You have technology at the bleeding edge, and then you've got a huge amount of money. Formula One is just such a fantastic thing. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, let's get a few base things locked in. So in modern Formula One, you have a Drivers' and a Constructors' Championship. These are things I've mentioned already in passing. Drivers' Championship is just that. Each team has 2 drivers, and those drivers go out there and race. If they finish in the top 10, they score between 1 and 25 points. If they then go on to continue and score points throughout the year, they could be in a chance of winning that championship. Most points at the end of the year wins the championship. Fairly simple. And then in terms of that, the Constructors' Championship is then the thing that's actually more important for the teams. Unsurprisingly, it's got their name on it. But the Constructors' Championship then determines how much prize money they will get as a result of their performance that year. And how do they calculate the points of the Constructors' Championship? Well, you combine your 2 drivers' points into one total. Let's say you have a driver who wins the championship with 250 points, and the other driver comes second with 249 points. Then you're looking at a Constructors' Championship total of 499. Now, if that goes on and, you have such a competitive pairing where the 2 cars are so thinly separated by points, clearly you're getting the most out of both of your drivers and they're probably getting the most out of the car. But then you sometimes have those situations where teams find that their drivers are not necessarily on an equal footing. You take, for example, last year, Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll at Aston Martin. Alonso's first season with the team, Alonso, the champion of 2005 and 2006. He has been going in Formula One for a long, long time. He was able to outscore Stroll by such an enormous margin. So much so that if Stroll had been able to match Alonso's total, then Alonso and Aston Martin would have been recipients of 4th or possibly even 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship. As it was, they finished 5th. And so that's then where sometimes these weaknesses in drivers can come in. And that's why you need a team that is firing on all cylinders, not just in the design part of things, the manufacture, but also on the track. But then that is a double-edged sword. If you have 2 drivers who are fighting incredibly hard for the same bit of tarmac, they're more likely to have incidents. And if you have an incident, if you have a crash, then of course you have a big problem. It then means that you have drivers racking up your bills as far as then producing more parts for the car are concerned to be able to go ahead and get it back on the track again for the next race. And of course, any points you were potentially going to score from that race suddenly don't go to you. You get nothing, diddly squat. But your rivals do get something, because all of a sudden 2 cars ahead of them have disappeared and they can move up into those slots. So driver pairing is incredibly important in Formula One, and they're not necessarily all equal. Sometimes one very dominant driver and one very poor driver, in comparison, can actually be a good thing for a team if they have a car advantage. Because Formula One, of course, is built to a very tight set of regulations. But those regulations are just that. They're a rule framework. And then the teams go out and they construct the cars. That's why we get Constructors' Championship. And so when it comes to constructing those cars are not equal. You do have teams that have good years and have bad years. You have a back of the field and a front of the field. It's the nature of competition. It's the nature of sport. You are always going to have a winner and a loser. You're not going to necessarily always get a scenario where people can share the rewards of victory. And certainly in Formula One, a sport where differences between cars are measured in thousandths of a second, well, that's not really something that's entirely feasible. To give you one example, that goes all the way back to 1997. In qualifying for the final race of the year being held at Jerez in Spain, the top 3 drivers set to the thousandth the exact same lap time. Now, how did they determine who ended up then going in those first 3 positions? What order would those cars take? Jacques Villeneuve, Michael Schumacher, and then Heinz-Harald Frentzen. Well, it was done by the fact that Villeneuve crossed the line first to set their time. So they were already at the top. Schumacher came along next, and he didn't beat Villeneuve's time. He matched it, so he went in second. And then Frentzen, same thing, down in 3rd place. So there's always going to be a winner and a loser, even if you have no separation there. And that's what I think is really fascinating about Formula One, is there is no way of being able to share the rewards. It is cutthroat. And so to that end, in Formula One, your teammate is your worst enemy. Paradoxically, you go to any other team sport, everybody, in theory, pulls in one direction for the best end result. But Formula One, yes, the drivers are doing that, but if you're beaten by your teammate, well, you've been beaten in the same machinery as somebody else. The other cars on the grid, you can maybe make an argument when you're beaten one day, well, they had a better car than me today. That's why they beat me. But your teammate, they've got the exact same equipment as you, in theory. More on that later. But they, in theory, have the exact same equipment as you, and they've beaten you, so you've got nowhere to hide. So when you are maybe trying to make yourself look attractive to jump to another team, where there are better prospects, if you're at a team like, say, what was Alfa Romeo last year is now Stake Sauber this year, or Kick Sauber, or just Sauber, whatever they're going to be called. I don't know just yet. But that's then going to be a situation where if you're beaten by your teammate, maybe that bigger team, like, say, a Ferrari, a Red Bull, a Mercedes, a McLaren, they're not going to necessarily want you if you've been trounced by your teammate. They'll be much more interested in your teammate if they're interested in you at all. So it is so important to be competitive in Formula One. So important, in fact, that, again, another brief example. You will find this, by the way, as we go through these episodes. It's going to get a bit more frantic. It's going to get a bit more tangent heavy. It's going to be all these sorts of things. As I get more comfortable doing this, as we get a bit more fun and comedic and things like that, we'll start bouncing all over the place, all over the shop. But for the time being, at least, looking to 2016 as one example, Nico Rosberg won the championship that year. And in one particular race at Japan, he talks after the fact about how he only beat Hamilton by a few hundredths or thousandths of a second. And he credited it to going to the gym the night before. Because he says that he did so much work in the gym that he lost, however much weight. Would have been a tiny amount. We're not talking about him losing kilos the night before the race or anything like that. But he went to the gym, he then sweated out however much it was, and then the next day he beat Hamilton by such a fine margin that actually, if you calculate the amount of weight that he lost in the gym, if he'd not gone to the gym, he wouldn't have beaten Hamilton. That few thousandths of a second was what was required. And again, it's fascinating. It's so fine, these margins. Now, when we then talk about Formula One in the modern day, let's just throw a bunch of quick-fire things in here. The modern cars in Formula One have a 1.6-litre V6 turbo hybrid engine. These cars that I talk about with having the most advanced internal combustion engines ever designed by humanity, well, they are, as a power unit, over 50% thermally efficient, which is remarkable if you're into your physics. If you're not into your physics, then it's just really, really good. They are producing about 1,000 combined horsepower, and of that, yes, there is some hybrid systems, some electrical power that's kicking them along, but it's only about 160 brake horsepower. The rest of that roughly 840, is coming just from a 1.6-litre V6 turbo engine. You could find more displacement in terms of litres in a milk carton at the supermarket, and yet they're getting 840 horsepower out of it. It is remarkable what these engines can do. Not only that, but you compare to Formula One of years gone by, you go back to, say, 2005, the last year of the V10 engines in Formula One, 3-litre, naturally aspirated, the best soundtrack I think Formula One has ever had. And those particular engines, they were in a bit of a quagmire that season, because they were suddenly faced with, we have to make the engines last 2 whole race weekends. Prior to that, you'd essentially be throwing a new engine in every single weekend. If you go back to the 1980s, for example, you had what you called grenade engines, because there were turbos involved in Formula One in those days, as they are now, but used in a subtly different way. Because back then, you'd still be able to get about 1,000 or even over 1,000 horsepower out of those engines, and they'd be about 1.5 litres worth of displacement. But in order to do so, you'd have to turn the turbo boost all the way up, which meant that the engine would shake itself apart or explode after about 2 or 3 laps. But those 2 or 3 laps would be enough for you to be able to go out in qualifying, set a lap time, and then come back into the garage. So it was worth it. But not adjusted for inflation, those engines could cost as much as $250,000. In 1980s money. And so therefore, when you're thinking about, in one car, you're probably going to be using at least one engine for practice, one or maybe even 2 engines for qualifying, and then an engine in the race. So you could be using as many as 4 engines per weekend. So you could be spending $1 million in 80s money in a weekend. And that's on one car. You've got 2 cars to run. So you'd be looking at $2 million just on the engine, never mind on all of the personnel and moving it around the world, the drivers' salaries, in terms of all the parts you had to buy in, things like the tyres from the tyre supplier and all these other various bits and pieces, these other costs that go into Formula One. It's remarkable, the amount of power and everything else that we get out of it then, but to then compare to the modern day, so we have those grenade engines of the 80s where you go through multiple engines per weekend. 2005, you get to the end of the V10 era in Formula One, where for the previous 6-7 years or so it had been enshrined in the rules, you had to have a V10 3-litre engine. So they've gone through all of that time worth of development, improving the power output, the reliability, all these various things, and they're shocked by this idea that they have to get them to last for 2 weekends. Not only that, but then you jump to the modern day, and these 1.6-litre engines that are getting 1,000 horsepower out of them, the most efficient engines ever designed, they will use just 4 of them in a year. 4 in a year! It's remarkable. Now, we've just crossed over the half-hour mark in terms of my timer here. And I am aware that not everybody listening to this is going to be a complete and total F1 newbie. So we're going to start to move things on to the more current events now. And so if you are new to Formula One, hopefully I'm going to be able to give enough context to some of these things for you. If not, I apologise, fire me a tweet, fire me an email, and we will then start to discuss these things in the following podcasts. But let's start to go through. Now, there is a friend of mine called Jeppe. I'm going to plagiarise one of his tweets here to give you a quick Cliff Notes version of some of the things that have been going on in the off-season. Starting with the most recent, we've got Lewis Hamilton with a driver move. You've got a new team in the form of Andretti being rejected. Günther Steiner, the former team principal at Haas, was sacked. Christian Horner, the 20-year-long team principal at Red Bull Racing, might be sacked. Sauber can't be called stake, according to a Swiss gambling commission. Sauber are based in Switzerland, so there you go. The Singapore Grand Prix might no longer be a thing. The Barcelona Grand Prix might no longer be a thing. The Chicago Grand Prix might be a thing. The Madrid Grand Prix is going to be a thing. Suzuka is a thing until at least 2029, Suzuka being the Japanese Grand Prix. You've then got the schedule might be extended to as many as 30 races, bearing in mind we're at 24 now, which is the largest the calendar has ever been. And in, say, 10, 20 years ago, you'd be looking at more like 17, 18 races in a season. 3 engines per season has been increased to 4, as we say. So 4 in a year this year, but the previous year, just 3 engines. Leclerc's Spotify was hacked. Lando Norris extended his contract with McLaren. Nick de Vries had to pay back a €250,000 racing loan, as well as half of his Formula One salary for the half a season that he did last year, where he finished at the back in a 20-driver championship in 24th. You then had Australia back as the season opener in 2025, which is both a great thing and a bad thing for reasons we'll go into. Charles Leclerc has extended his contract with Ferrari, and the Wolffs, that being Toto Wolff, the team principal of Mercedes-Benz, and Susie Wolff, his wife, who is the leader of F1 Academy, which is F1's effort to be more inclusive in terms of getting a female racing series to encourage young female drivers up into Formula One. They were accused of and then cleared of passing confidential insider info to one another. Jeppe then asks, did I miss anything? I don't think so. Not really. Not anything of any significance anyway. So let's start to go through all of those things then. And we should start with Lewis Hamilton, because this is really something that has rocked the driver market. Lewis Hamilton, he started his racing career as a young boy who raced remote control cars. Then he eventually gets into karting. And his dad has to work 3 jobs at the same time. They are not well off. It's him and realistically one other driver on the grid, Esteban Ocon, who come from much more humble beginnings compared to the rest. The rest are all drivers who have had some sort of financial leg up, shall we say, in terms of their families. And that's no bad thing. Some of the greatest drivers in Formula One have had a similar sort of upbringing. Ayrton Senna, for example, one of the greatest of all time, certainly I think the greatest of all time. They were a pay driver. They had enormous money and reserves from their families in the beginnings of their career, and then they got big sponsors that would pay their way into the junior categories and then into Formula One itself. Niki Lauda, of course, had to secure a bank loan in order to be able to get his Formula One drive with BRM, I believe it was initially, at the beginning of his F1 career. And yet he then went on to win 3 world titles, be considered one of the greats, and of course the only driver to win a title with both Ferrari and McLaren. So drivers coming from a privileged background is nothing new to Formula One. But Hamilton and Ocon, but focusing on Hamilton for the time being because it's their news, is one of the outliers. They managed to get their way into proper racing, really. It's not to suggest that karting is not, but in terms of cars, that's the more appropriate way of describing it, by getting a connection with McLaren and Ron Dennis, the then team boss and owner of the McLaren Formula One team. Now, at that point in time, in the sort of the mid-1990s, going into the late 90s, McLaren had a arrangement with Mercedes-Benz where they were essentially the de facto Mercedes team. I mentioned before that Mercedes, of course, bought Brawn GP in 2009, turned it into Mercedes in 2010, so there is now a Mercedes Formula One team again, after they briefly ran in the 1950s as a team. It's not the exact same team, they're not based out the same place or the same people or anything like that, but that's overcomplicating matters, and we'll get to that another time. But when it came to Lewis, he goes through the McLaren Junior program. He's supported through his junior career in cars by McLaren and by extension by Mercedes. He then races for McLaren in Formula One, wins his first world championship with McLaren, all with Mercedes power throughout this time. Then at the end of 2012, going into 2013, he announces a shock move. He goes from McLaren, who had competed for the world championship all of the years that he had been in Formula One, from 2007 until 2012, maybe with the exception of 2009. In fact, definitely with the exception of 2009, let's be honest. If they'd had the car that they had from sort of the midpoint of the season onwards, at the beginning of the year, then they would have been competing in the championship. But they didn't. Again, tangent, we'll move on. But in all those years, 2009 accepted, McLaren were always in the title hunt. And he then goes to Mercedes in 2013. And Mercedes, up until that point, even though they were the main Mercedes team now, no longer McLaren, Mercedes started to sell off their shares in McLaren, for example, in this period of time. You know, despite that, Mercedes was still viewed as a bad move. It was viewed as a downgrade, essentially. And so Lewis goes to Mercedes, and then with Mercedes power, he wins a race. In 2013, he wins at the Hungaroring, a circuit that he has won at so many times over the years. And then 2014, 2015, 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020, well, he wins all 6 of those world championships. And if you're not familiar with the 2021 World Championship, that's a whole episode in and of itself. We won't go into that here today. But there was an awful lot of controversy surrounding that particular season and whether or not it should have been Max Verstappen, who is the champion of that season, or Lewis Hamilton, who should have been champion that season, or not. Again, we'll spend a whole episode on that. But when it comes to the overall landscape and trajectory of his career, it was expected that Hamilton was really going to just serve out the next 2 years of his contract, a contract he only signed last year, with Mercedes-Benz to race in 24 and 25, and then probably retire at that point. But of course, with an aim to Mercedes helping him to win that elusive 8th world title. And an 8th world championship would then make him undeniably the greatest of all time, certainly from a statistical point of view. Of course, there are people with all their opinions as to who is actually the greatest of all time, regardless as to what the the record books say. But that would certainly make him the undisputed number 1 from a records perspective. So, naturally, the logical thing is that he then signed for Ferrari for 2025 and 26 with an option, allegedly, for 2027 as well. And this has kind of sent Formula One into a bit of an uproar, really. Up until this point, the driver market was already looking a little bit bizarre going into this season because 23 into 24 has been the first ever occasion in the championship's history where the team lineups have remained exactly the same. The official Formula One video game is not going to have very much work to do in terms of how to set up the drivers for this year's game. Control-C, Control-V, I imagine, for the Codemasters developer there. But in terms of that, you know, this then led to a situation where at the end of this year, 2024, there were a number of, well, the vast majority of the grid, in fact, are out of contract. So there's predicted to be a huge move around of various different drivers. You've, of course, got drivers from other categories of racing, particularly Formula 2 and Formula 3, the junior categories immediately beneath Formula 1. There is expectation that some of those drivers will make the jump up next year as well, or certainly be entertained for making the jump up next year. And so what we were expecting to happen was a relatively benign situation at Mercedes-Benz. Because Mercedes were one of those very few teams on the grid where they'd actually locked out their driver lineup, seemingly. And so the fact that Hamilton was then reneging on that contract, even before he's turned a wheel in this year's car, which I don't know how much of a damning statement that is on the potential of Mercedes for this year. But, it's remarkable. He's always made such a big thing about how he's been supported by Mercedes from such a young age. He's come through Formula One as a Mercedes driver and all that time. And now, at the twilight end of his career, he's suddenly jumping across to the team in red. It's all very interesting. I think that it's one of these things as well where people are jumping the gun a little bit as to what they're predicting is going to happen as far as the driver market is concerned. There's a bit of talk, for example, of course, the big talk is who's going to replace him. There was some initial consideration that maybe it would just be a simple seat swap. Carlos Sainz, who is losing his seat at Ferrari because of Hamilton coming into that team, well, he could potentially take the Mercedes seat. But there's now been some discussion in the media that it's actually going to be either Fernando Alonso, who is still in Formula One in his 40s, or it could be, at the total other end of the spectrum, a driver who is in Formula 2 going into this season. Andrea Kimi Antonelli, Mercedes junior prospect who they are touting as the next Max Verstappen. And, I think they're jumping a gun a little bit on that because Mercedes, of course, going into this year have changed the concept of their car. And what do we mean by the concept of their car for the newbies? Well, essentially, in Formula One, we talked before about how you have these various different rules and regulations. And with those rules and regulations, it's essentially saying, here is a tunnel. This is not actually what the rules say, but just as a analogy. Here is a tunnel. You have to make a car to get through that tunnel as quickly as possible. Some teams, in this hypothetical scenario here, are going to make a car that's got lightweight in order to try and therefore mean that it will accelerate quicker and get up to its top speed quicker. Others will go for a big heavy engine that produces a huge amount of power. Others will try 6 wheels. Some will try 4. Some will try 3. This is sort of essentially the thing. It's the Formula One, there is a hole that you have to get through and, you can make various different shapes to get through that hole. But essentially, there does become a point where it becomes pretty obvious that one team or a series of teams have hit upon a particular design concept that works better than all the others. And when it comes to that, Red Bull are most certainly the class leaders at the moment. Formula One, throughout all of its history from 1950 to now, the cars you can pretty much track a continuous level of improvement in speed in all that time. But it's then punctuated over the years by sudden drops in speed where there is a big regulation change. So things like the type of engine that goes in the car, the amount of fuel you're allowed on board, whether there is refueling allowed in the race, how much crash structure you've got to have into the cars, how safe they've got to be, how big the wings can be, how small they can be, how big or small the wheels are on the car. All these other various different bits and pieces. Loads and loads of rules have been tweaked and changed in Formula One over the years. Frankly, if you wanted to be able to look through the rule book at this point, you'd probably have to slap a couple of different A to Zs on top of each other just to be able to get some relative thickness akin to what the Formula One rulebook looks like over time, and you add in all those various rule changes over the years. But when it comes to this current breed of cars then, 2022 is when this new set of technical rules was introduced. It's the largest technical overhaul that Formula One has ever seen. But when you then consider that, these cars are therefore relatively in their infancy, you've got teams that got it right and got it wrong in terms of the concepts they started down. And Mercedes got it wrong. They opted for a design which they called the Zero Pod. And to try and visualize that for anybody who doesn't know what I'm on about, essentially on the sides of a Formula One car, you've got these great big air ducts, for lack of a more entry-level term. And that's because in Formula One, you can't have any fans in the car. You can't have air being sucked in. It's got to just come in through the car, traveling through the air. So you've got these great big openings at the side of the car to suck the air into. Now, what Mercedes tried to do was they tried to essentially shrink-wrap those down so small as to be basically not there, hence Zero Pod. And what ended up happening there was that they basically just didn't get the performance that they anticipated. And they can't simply just slap on a different side pod, because then you're starting to essentially cross the streams when it comes to different concepts of car design. And you want to therefore you could actually end up making your car slower, really, by adopting another team's part or by trying to copy that part. There are some parts you can copy from other teams in terms of a visual inspection and sort of go, oh, well, they're trying to do this with that, so let's try and do the same thing with our car in that area. And sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't. This is the big trade-off that teams have got to do. But as I say, going into this year, Formula One is seeing Mercedes and a few other teams, notably Ferrari as well, abandoning these older concepts they started this rule cycle with and going into a new one. So this is why I think that maybe the pundits are jumping the gun a bit when it comes to Fernando Alonso moving to Mercedes, because Aston Martin moved to the concept that they're on now, which is pretty aligned with the Red Bull concept, in 2022. It's not the car they started the season with, but after a mid-season upgrade, they then set themselves on the same path. So it might well be that Aston are able to outperform the Mercedes team this year, and going into next year, well, if you were Alonso, which would you rather be at? If Aston outperformed Mercedes in 2024, then do you want to stay with a team that is built around you, that wants you to be there, or do you want to take a chance on a team that, yes, did win 8 constructors and 7 drivers' titles in a row, but then, of course, haven't won any more than one race in the last 2 years? On the basis that, oh, well, they used to be really successful, so maybe they will be successful next year. Or do you just stay with Aston? I think this is one of these things where the Mercedes driver decision is not going to come out until much, much later in the year. I think that they're going to delay it as much as possible because they're going to want to evaluate their F2 driver, Kimi Antonelli. They're going to want to try and figure out if he is Formula One material. Well, he's undoubtedly Formula One material from looking at any of his junior category results. But if he's able to perform in F2 to the same standard he has done previously, then he's definitely Formula One material. And then Mercedes might even just parachute a rookie straight into their main team. They could be that confident with him. But we've got to wait and see. And Alonso holds the cards there in that particular negotiation. Because, of course, if he suspects that Mercedes are not going to be as competitive a package as Aston Martin, then they would need to do a huge amount to be able to tempt him away. So we'll have to wait and see. But yes, Hamilton to Ferrari, that then means he's going to be at the red team for the new car and engine rules that come in 2026. So we are no longer going to have 840 horsepower coming from the internal combustion engine, 160 coming from the hybrid unit. Instead, it's going to be a roughly 50-50 split, still aiming for 1,000 horsepower. So with that, it's going to be a fundamental change to engine design and car design. As well as that, there's also going to be various different car rules that are going to be changed as well. And a number of those have been mooted so far as potential things. The rules haven't been published yet. But it could be that we end up going to slightly narrower cars, slightly narrower tyres, and then various different changes under the skin to then try and promote better racing between the teams as well. So I think Hamilton might have ended up doing a similar thing to what he's done in 2013. 2013, that was the last year of the V8 engines before we went into the V6 units that we have these days. There were a number of car changes that happened between those 2 years as well in terms of the design. And ultimately, he was able to go to a team that had all of its ducks in a row and were able to deliver him a championship-winning car at the second year. He might have been able to do that again with Ferrari, but 2026 is when we'll have to wait and see whether that bears fruit. So that's Hamilton to Ferrari. I spent an awful lot of time talking about that, an awful lot more than I thought I was going to. Let's talk next about team principles. Team principles in Formula One seem to be a not long-lived thing at the moment, because with the exception of Christian Horner, I think the next longest tenure that a team boss has is Toto Wolff at Mercedes-Benz. And that's really, it is in large part down to the fact that he is a very effective leader, but he also part owns the team. It's very difficult to sack somebody who owns the organisation. Albeit it's a third ownership, he doesn't have a majority stake in the team. But, by the same token, it's still quite a difficult thing to unseat him there. But apart from that, you've got team principal at McLaren is Andreas Stella. He only came in as the team principal last year after Andreas Seidel left to go to Sauber for the Audi project that's coming in 2026. You've got Ferrari, Fred Vasseur. He's only done 1 year at the Red Team as well. He's now going to his second season with Ferrari. Christian Horner, as we mentioned earlier on, he has been there for 20 years, so he is the real long-term incumbent. Then you've got, of course, as we go further down the grid, you've got Aston Martin, Mike Krack. You didn't hear me misspeak that. It is Mike Krack is the name of the team principal there. And they then, of course, have been in the job there for just a couple of years as well. You've then got the likes of, well, who's next down on the list? You've got Alpine. Who knows who Alpine's team principal is at this point? I'm sure it was mentioned at their team launch, and I've just already forgotten. Because, let's be honest, they're probably already going to be sacked in the next few months anyway. Alpine is a team that's gone through all sorts of management turmoil in the last few years. They had Otmar Zafnauer for a while. They had Cyril Abiteboul before that. They had Laurent Rossi as the CEO of Alpine, who was frankly getting far too involved and micromanaging. And Laurent Rossi is the kind of individual who I would never want to work for, because they are the sort of CEO that takes all of the credit when everything is going well and then slags the organisation off when it's going badly and disavows it and says this has nothing to do with me. So it's a good thing that he's gone and is no longer the CEO of Alpine as far as they're concerned. But yeah, their new team principal is starting this year. Then after Alpine, oh crikey, then we've got the rest of the grid. Let's just pick out some at random. Let's say Williams. James Vowles has been there for 1 or 2 seasons so far. So again, very short term. Gunther Steiner at Haas, as we mentioned before, he's been sacked from Haas. So the team principal since 2016 will no longer be going into 2024. So as a result, it's Ayo Komatsu now, and he's brand new in the job. And on it goes. And for Steak Sauber, Kick Sauber, Sauber, Audi Sauber, whatever you want to call them, they have got Andreas Seidel, I believe, as the team principal, though he might be the CEO instead. And then there's another chap who sort of does all the media stuff and goes to the races, whose name I can't remember. But yeah, they're not long in that job either. They only went into it last year, to coincide, of course, with the move of Andrea Stella going up to the team principal role at McLaren. Or rather, it was Seidel who moved first, and then Stella moved into his spot at McLaren, but you take my point. Who else have we got? We've then got, then we've got Toro Rosso / Minardi / AlphaTauri / Visa Cash App RB / VCarb / RB, whatever they're called. The Faenza-based team, basically. They have got, who is it? It's Laurent Mekies now, I think, isn't it? Laurent Mekies is taking over from Franz Tost, who has led that team ever since it was first bought by Red Bull in 2006. So, again, another long-term incumbent gone. So Mekies is now in charge over there. Who else we got then? In terms of teams, I think we've covered everybody. I probably haven't, but I haven't been counting, frankly. So yeah, we'll just have to deal with that one. But yeah, team principals are seemingly a vanishing breed. And so Gunther Steiner was sacked, according to various different reports, because there was a disagreement between himself and Gene Haas as far as the direction the team should be going in. Gene Haas has said more recently that, of course, he wants the team to be competitive and successful and all these various different bits and pieces, and they should be getting more out of what they have already. But there is a bit of underinvestment in that team. You know, they do now have this new design facility at Maranello that they kind of share but don't share with Ferrari. They've then got that very small industrial unit in Banbury in the UK, and then they've got their sort of marketing and I think design operations are based over in Kannapolis in the USA. So it's a team that is a bit disparate. It's spread out over 2 different continents, 3 different countries. And from the outside looking in, it looks a bit of an organisational nightmare to try and deal with and try and have a cohesive bond between all those organisations. It's difficult enough for Enstone, for Alpine, where they are officially labelled as a French team, but as I say, they're based in Enstone in the UK, except they're not, because that's where the car is built and designed and everything else, but the engine is made in France by Renault employees at Viry-Châtillon. So that's apparently a difficult relationship to reconcile between those 2 parties, and they don't like each other according to various different reports and so on and so forth. I'm sure that they would deny that, of course, but Yeah, it's one of these things where getting these departments all to speak to one another properly is a tricky thing. And with the unique model that Haas entered Formula One into, where they essentially bought as many parts as they were legally allowed to from another team and then designed everything else themselves, or got Dallara to design some of it, it was then, one of these things where, Steiner has since said from his exit that maybe it's a model that now needs to change. Maybe it's something that doesn't work anymore in Formula One. So these are things that they need to consider, and of course that Haas itself needs to consider. But Komatsu's leadership is just beginning. Hopefully they don't fall into the trap, or certainly the ownership of Gene Haas doesn't fall into the trap of, the modern world, in that there is instant gratification in most things, but in Formula One you need time. Things need to build up. And so if you want a change of direction or change of leadership to bear fruit, realistically, you're going to need to give them at least 2-3 years, at least, to then start to see the results of that. So I'm interested to see what Komatsu does. I'm interested to see how Haas evolves. But then there is the other end of the pit lane. There is Red Bull and Christian Horner, and he may have to resign from his post, or may be sacked from his post. This is allegedly to do with an aggressive management style. Or an inappropriate management style, or inappropriate messages, or there's all sorts of hearsay going around about it at the moment. And allegedly it's this, and then allegedly it's that, and all this sort of thing. So frankly, I think I'm going to park that particular topic. We'll talk about that as and when the hearings and all the independent investigations and so on come to an end, and we get a resolution of everything. Because it could be that he is perfectly safe in his job. Allegedly, according to somebody who I saw a tweet from the other day, who claims to work at Red Bull Powertrains, who of course are making the new engines for 2026 for Red Bull, everybody within RBPT and then Red Bull Racing itself love Christian Horner, and they understand his management style, and they don't think that it's aggressive or inappropriate or blah, 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 and they believe him, ultimately, when he denies the allegations. Again, I say allegedly because I've not verified this person. I've not been able to get in contact with them in any way, shape or form to be able to verify these things. But if that is true, then it could be something from more on high. But again, we will discuss that as and when more information comes out. Wow, I've got 4 minutes to go. Oh dear. Right, let's have a look. In terms of track contracts, let's just take the two that I know for certain here. So Barcelona might be in trouble. It might not be. Barcelona, of course, has been the Spanish Grand Prix venue for many, 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 many years, with the exception of a couple of rounds, I believe, or maybe possibly not. Jerez did host some races for a while. I forget whether that was the Spanish Grand Prix or whether that was the European Grand Prix, but certainly Barcelona has been a mainstay on Formula One's calendar for many, many, many years, since it was introduced in 1991. And when it came to the announcement of the Madrid Grand Prix, that is going to be the new home of the Spanish Grand Prix from 2026 onwards. And I believe they have a 10-year deal. Now, when it comes to that, of course, that then means that Barcelona, yes, potentially is in a little bit of jeopardy. But Formula One looking to expand the calendar, I mean, we said earlier on, it could be as much as 30 races in the future. There is some hope that Barcelona continues to run. I mean, certainly, I believe their deal continues to run until 27 or 28, maybe. So there will be 2 races in Spain for a brief period of time, if not indefinitely. So that's one to keep an eye on there. But Madrid, I mean, I've driven around virtually that track, did some stuff with Williams Esports, where they got some content creators and some of their hosts on the channel and other bits and pieces, some of their esports drivers as well, to drive that car around in Assetto Corsa. And it's fine, I guess. It's okay. It's got a decent flow to it, better than I was expecting, certainly, from the look at the track map. But I do wonder if it's going to be a difficult track to overtake on. I wonder if it's going to be a spectacle that actually appeals to fans, or whether it's just another one of these street races that is, designed to bring the racing closer to the fans and to the people. But is it going to result in a better product? I don't know. Suzuka has extended until 2029. I believe Silverstone has extended for another 10 years as well. So 2034, we're going to have the British Grand Prix at Silverstone as well. So they're great things. Those 2 circuits are absolutely fantastic, and they should be on the Formula One calendar. Suzuka, yes, maybe not the best circuit for overtaking, but it is a great driver circuit. It's a great circuit to watch cars going around, Formula One cars in particular, going around and doing what they're designed to do, which is go as fast as possible around a racing circuit in the world. Absolutely brilliant to see that they have been extended there. Looking at these other ones, let's just have a brief look at all of them. I think let's park these topics, actually. We've got a minute and a half now to go. Let's have a little bit of a look forward to episode 2 of the Race O'Clock podcast. That'll come out next Wednesday in the middle of the week there, so that'll be the 21st. So that'll be the first day of pre-season testing. So because we do not record these live, or certainly not record them and then just hit upload on the Wednesday, it's then going to be me recording prior to the beginning of pre-season testing. So it's one of these things where we will probably be going over the car launches as opposed to the testing itself. And so we'll break down some of the technical detail. We'll get into some of that. Hopefully, if all of you start to tweet and send emails and all these other bits and pieces, we can have a bit of Q&A going on as well, and sort of discussing the topics you actually want to hear about. And then, of course, the week after that, we can then have a bit of a wrap-up of testing as well. But that is pretty much it. We've technically got 34 seconds left to go, but I'm going to start to wrap things up here as far as that's concerned. So that is our hour done as far as I'm concerned. So now let's just do our wrap-ups here. If you have enjoyed the podcast today, please do follow us on social media. It is at Race O'Clock Pod on both Instagram and Twitter. On YouTube, if you are listening to this on Spotify, well, we're going to upload these on YouTube as well. And so if you want to follow the YouTube channel, subscribe over there, then that is at Race O'Clock Podcast, and we will maybe upload some more short-form content over there, possibly on Spotify as well. So please do subscribe to both Spotify and YouTube. Share this with all of your friends. Share it on your social media. Let us know what you thought. And as we say, send us tweets to at Race O'Clock Pod. Start it with Dear Dan if you want a question for the podcast. And if you want to email us a question instead, that is raceoclockpodcast@gmail.com. All these things will be in the description of this episode. But that has been our show for today. Thank you very much for listening or watching if you're on YouTube. And we will see you next time for the Race O'Clock podcast. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night.